Now? Yes. Well, hello everyone. Thank you to be here, to listen this panel. And I'm very glad to be here for the second time in 2 years with Professor Peter Lofer and 2 new hosts for our gang of slow newsers. But here we are with Damian Radcliffe. Is correct? Okay. Chambers Chair in Journalism at the University of Oregon. And Daniela Kraus, Director of Forum Journalism and Media in Vienna. And of course, Peter Lofer, the main character, the founder of Slow News Movement. Yeah, it's a good definition. Why are we there? Speaking about a word that is such ancient meaning as slowness. We are in the age of acceleration everywhere, and we want to come back, to step down, to slow down, and to try to redefine our role as journalists in this society faster, every time more faster. And so I don't bore you more. The hosts are there, and so I let them speak about this. And I want to start with a simple question to Peter that started the movement, I think 7 years ago in my city, in Milan. This is a strange thing. But why and when you decide that you have to do something to the scenario, to the nightmare scenario that you face off?
So hello to all of you. It's really terrific to be here and to be back again after a year. And there's the microphone. I come from a radio background, so I really don't need a microphone. We just project. The slow news idea, which is not unique to those of us at the table here, but which I embraced about 7 years ago here in Italy, comes out perhaps from the slow food movement, which comes from here in Italy. And the abuses that we currently are experiencing in the United States under the Trump presidency are real-time, right now examples of what's wrong with the 24-hour news cycle. The 24-hour news cycle is allowing this extraordinary, non-stop, relentless abuse of media and news media in particular, and the ethics of journalism as practiced traditionally by those who care about some sort of responsible way of purveying information. So there's no way to stop this, because even the, what did you call me, of slow news, of course I have one of these in my pocket, and even though this book, which is my manifesto for slow news, begins with me in a saloon in the far west coast of North America with a pencil and a piece of paper, there's no way we're going to stop this. So what I present to you and suggest, and what my comrades here will engage, I hope, is the idea that the onus is on us, the news consumers. There's no way we're going to stop this acceleration, but we don't have to be victims of it. And so I recommend that we take charge. That doesn't mean something like citizen journalism, which is ludicrous. There's a Brussels journalist who says something along the lines that if you want to get your news from a citizen journalist, then I want to introduce you to my citizen dentist. It just does not work. We need professionals, because otherwise we just have a dump. We just have a dump of information and information overload. We need the professional news reporter, but we as consumers have to know when to shut the stuff off, when to leave the iPhone in the car or at home when we go out to dinner. We need to have some so-called news-free days where we just don't engage in this 24-hour news cycle. The 24-hour news cycle fuels our innate fight or flight instincts that raise our stress level, we don't need to see the airplanes go into the Twin Towers over and over and over and over again. We do not need to see Donald Trump every day over and over and over again. It makes us ill, literally, and it makes journalists be on a treadmill where there's no time to report. So we have to acknowledge that we want to be informed. We have to appreciate the fact that we may be news junkies ourselves, but temper that, because otherwise we're going to burn out and we're going to be victimized by more Trumps who bring this information overload to us in a manner that makes it impossible for us to process it, and we end up really knowing nothing. We need to embrace il dolce fa niente. Mare oder weniger, is that right? Yeah.
Yes.
And so before I turn this over to my colleagues here, I want to just read the dedication to the book, because it's dedicated to my wife Sheila, and it shows that I am as much a victim even historically, because she and I met many years ago in a little town in the Nevada desert, and it says, with love to Sheila, who questioned my priorities whenever I drove our old Chevy pickup 17 miles across the Nevada desert just to buy the latest edition of the San Francisco Chronicle. So I know what a problem it is, but we are the responsible parties. We have to take care of ourselves so we get the right information and we don't make ourselves sick.
Yes, Daniela, I wish to take a part of the speech of Peter, because it's very interesting that you speak about the reader responsibilities, and so it comes to my mind that there is a public for the slow journalism. How is the market also for this? There is someone that want and need also our.
I can very gladly take a piece of Peter's speech, but first I want to take the piece of your speech where you said you can leave your iPad in the car. I remember an episode, and maybe it shows how radically you follow your own advice when you left your iPad on the car, just not to follow the news, and drove hundreds and hundreds of miles with the iPad on the car. So in case you're looking for a method to slow down your news cycle, you can follow Peter and leave your stuff on the car. But to take on the other, on our topic on is there a market? I think there is a market. Recently, I took a look into the use behavior of 12 to 16-year-olds. If we just look at them, and then, as you all might know, one of the most used platforms is YouTube, and they're using lots and lots of YouTube. And I don't know who of you has watched the videos the young people are watching on YouTube. Children, it's like these Let's Play pieces. This is not news, but it's really, really slow. So I think that maybe the generation that grew up with digital has already a different way of perception and is not so much into the fast, 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 fast. This is one point that, of course, I can't prove, but for me it's a hint. On the other hand, if you watch which papers are successful, for example, in the German or Austrian market, then those who have the best chances to thrive and survive are those who do actually slow news in a sense, like, for example, the German Die Zeit weekly paper. They are really successful, and they are doing what, in my understanding, is slow news. It's about context, explaining, and giving orientation, basically.
Yeah. Passing to Damian, I wish to ask you, how could we make real this plan, this movement? How does slow journalism fit in the media behavior nowadays?
So that's a great question, and really to answer that I want to pick up on kind of three key areas: consumption, content creation, and resources and resource allocation within newsrooms. So you mentioned at the beginning, Andrea, about the fact that we're living in an age of acceleration. And certainly all the data and statistics suggest that. So depending on which studies or surveys you look at, if you have a smartphone, you look at it and touch it between 150 and 500 times a day. Teachers report that children arrive at school tired for class because they've woken up in the night and checked their cell phone, or they've been looking at content on YouTube, on a tablet, and so forth. People find it incredibly hard to switch off. And we're seeing an impact of that on attention spans. So back in 2015, Microsoft in Canada published research which said that the average attention span of a human being now is 4 seconds. A goldfish is 5 seconds. Says it all. And you also see just changing dynamics, for example, often in a social situation. There are certain restaurants in some trendy cities around the world whereby they have a rule that if you are a party dining, the person who touches their phone first pays the bill for everybody. And you can see people struggling really, really hard to not touch their phone. So we are living in this age of acceleration where technology has, in many cases, taken over our lives and where we find it very hard to kind of switch off from it. And as Peter said, this sort of 24/7 news cycle can be really exhausting, particularly in the kind of current political climate. There's always another article to read, another press conference to watch, more and more content to consume, and it is impossible to keep up with it. The volume of content that we're exposed to is overwhelming, and I think, therefore, that's one of the reasons why we've seen one of the kind of big trends over the last couple of years, which is the rise of newsletters, for example, a very old-fashioned form of communication, very kind of Web 1.0, but you see the rise of products like the Skim or Nextdraft or Quartz, and they're doing a lot of the kind of filtering for you, recognizing the fact that actually we don't have time to read everything, so let somebody else do that. And then we also have that in print format. I don't know if any of you are familiar with The Week, which I think is a really excellent publication that kind of summarizes on a weekly basis what's going out. Or even applications, smartphone apps like Nuzzle or even Apple News that are doing that kind of curation, both on a human level and also using algorithms to try and actually help you navigate your way through the digital minefield. So I think on the kind of consumption perspective, yes, I agree with Peter to some extent. We can take control of that, but we should also embrace some of the tools that are at our disposal to be able to do that, so that you can still be informed and exposed to a variety of different views, but perhaps more so on your own time scale. On the creation side, I actually do think that there is a role for newsrooms to take kind of some responsibilities in this space. We have to remember that journalists, in many cases, certainly in the US and then in the UK, are trusted less than almost any other profession now. Gallup said that since they started recording trust in particular professions in 1974 for journalists, we're now at the lowest possible ranking, only just above elected politicians. And there is definitely some kind of big existential questions going on about saying, well, how do we try and restore that trust? And if you see examples of news organizations reacting to things very quickly and perhaps making mistakes, so one good example would be the Time magazine story about the Churchill bust being removed from the White House, which was proved to be wrong, from the Oval Office. They quickly retracted that. But that was pounced on by critics of the media to say, there we go, fake news, you don't know what you're doing. So actually, in a climate where we're being criticized more than ever before, I think it's even more imperative than it ever has been to actually make sure you get your facts right, you get your names right, and you perhaps kind of pause before hitting the publish button. We see the same kind of things around areas of user-generated content. I think there's some really interesting kind of questions and dynamics, and my colleague Laurie Schontz is chairing a panel on this later on today, talking about the relationship that news organizations have with eyewitnesses and the role of eyewitness media. If you look at Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris back in 2015, the mass shooting in Roseburg, Oregon, 80 miles away from our campus back in 2015, you could argue that journalists are so keen to get the story that they sometimes neglect the kind of duty of care to people who have witnessed often very horrific events. And social enables you to arguably reach out and find and engage with people who have witnessed things quicker than ever before. Often whilst you're still mid-incident, you'll have newsrooms reaching out trying to get footage from people, but very rarely are they saying, are you okay? Are you in a safe place? Then contact us. They're too often asking for the footage and to get the material before any of their competitors. And that's always been the case, but technology has speeded up that process and arguably made that kind of duty of care question even less important and kind of less paramount in people's minds. We saw in Roseburg in Oregon, where a lot of the content and a lot of work was being done by stringers, many of whom had, first of all, never had any kind of exposure to working with large news networks. They'd also certainly never witnessed a mass shooting before. So again, what's the relationship with stringers in terms of duty of care in that space? And actually, how can you slow down that relationship to actually look after your stringers better? And then lastly, in that kind of breaking news situation, what are the questions around accuracy? The late Steve Buttrey wrote a fantastic piece on his blog talking about the San Bernardino shootings and someone who on Twitter trolled the media and pretended that they had been there and that they were a witness to it, and then ultimately revealed that it was all a prank. And they had deliberately set out to try and troll the media. And there were kind of telltale signs that maybe this person was not who they said they were, or they were not necessarily witness to the kind of things that they were talking about, but too much still was taken at face value because people didn't want to miss out or be kind of second with the story. But actually being second and being right is better than being first and being wrong. And then lastly, thirdly, I wanted to touch on resources. If you're in a newsroom, in most cases, you're going to be working in a newsroom that is smaller now than it was 5 years ago, and certainly than it was 10, 15, or 20 years ago. So news organizations in many cases are being challenged to do more with less. There is a pressure to produce stories more quickly, to produce content that can be sliced and diced and atomized and spread and distributed across a variety of digital platforms. Yet very few news organizations have kind of looked at that equation of saying we have fewer staff, we're having to produce more stories, and we're having to produce more assets from this, and said, so what are the things we're going to stop doing in this space? What are our priorities? What are the kind of things that we can offer that are unique to us and that others can't necessarily provide? And I think that's a really important question in this kind of slow news debate as well, is to say, actually, we can't necessarily do the things that we have always done. This is particularly true, I think, in local newspapers, which is an area I'm looking extensively at the moment, where there's, in many cases, not enough questions being asked about saying, where should our focus be? What should our priorities be, given the fact that we have a much smaller newsroom than we once did? So they do need to rethink their approach, and they're using kind of different tools like metrics, focus groups, creating kind of membership models, as well as kind of editorial and journalistic intuition to help do that. But they need to do more of that kind of taking a step back and thinking about purpose and priorities and where their focus and unique selling proposition might be in this kind of very clouded media landscape. But I also see some kind of signs of positivity in this kind of space. I mean, the resilience of weeklies. Daniela mentioned kind of one from the German-speaking market, but you also see it with the alt weeklies in the US. They're working on a different time scale to dailies. That gives them an opportunity to tell stories often in different and interesting and unique ways. They're not going to attract people to buy their publication because they're breaking stories. It's going to be based on more in-depth analysis and context. So that can be incredibly important. We continue to see the resilience of long-read stories on The New Yorker, The New York Times, New York Mag, Variety, a number of other different places. And Quartz, a couple of years ago, did some really interesting research which showed that essentially their audiences loved their 600-word articles and they loved their 1,200-word articles, and everything in between got a very, very low audience. And they had this kind of very dramatic kind of growth or kind of consumption curve to show that, which showed that audiences either wanted to consume content quickly and just kind of snack on it, but if you found the right story and you presented it in the right way, that there was a hope for long-form journalism. And even people like the kind of poster boys for the digital-born news organizations like Vice have also found that. If you look at the material that they first produced for Snapchat Discover, when that launched a couple of years ago, it was often long-form documentaries that they sliced into 30-second pieces. And they found that somebody would watch 10 30-second videos who would never watch one 5-minute video. So it's also about being creative in terms of the way that you present the material that you might have that kind of responds to this kind of age of acceleration that you mentioned at the beginning. So I'm kind of, I'm optimistic that there are kind of tools that are out there that we can take advantage of as consumers, but also recognize that newsrooms kind of need to do more in terms of thinking about how they react to their audience, how they respond to stories as they break, and also just what does newsroom culture look like in 2017, and does kind of slow news sit as part of their philosophy?
Yeah, well, one thing in response to that, of course, it's an interactive relationship, the audience and the producer, and as these newsrooms deal with being smaller, and as the audience fractures, a place that is definitely a slow news entry point is the idea of mass reporters at a single event. Michael Jackson's funeral attracted 5,000 some accredited journalists. The whole idea of accrediting a journalist to a funeral is intriguing in and of itself. And so were the newsrooms, especially these newsrooms reduced, as you say, in size, more judicious about picking and choosing what they cover and looking to cover something that's not being covered, that will intrigue a consumer who accepts the onus being on the consumer to look for a slower news pace that allows for the development of a story worth consuming. Let me just quote, if I may.
Quote yourself.
No, I'm not going to this time. This is a quote from the book, which is an Italian journalist, Tiziano Terzani, perhaps I'm pronouncing that close to correct, who noted in his fantastic book, A Fortune Teller Told Me, there is one aspect of a reporter's job that never ceases to fascinate and disturb me. Facts that go unreported do not exist. And that's a nice metaphysical reality that I think we take to the slow news concept.
Yeah. I was going to say, when you were talking about the kind of 5,000 journalists at Michael Jackson's funeral, but also kind of at other events, this throws up interesting questions around partnerships and pooling and kind of sharing of resources. And again, that in many cases goes against the grain of traditional newsroom culture, but in an environment where you have fewer resources and where actually people you might have previously viewed as the competition perhaps no longer are, we need to see more kind of content sharing opportunities. And it's really interesting that when you see like the likes of the Washington Post, the New York Times and others who are doing that, certainly with local organizations, as a way to kind of spread their reach. And those two are not in competition with one another. So they can.
And the Panama Paper is another example of that.
Great example.
Of newsrooms working together.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I want to follow up on something you said, that there's the concept of vitiati. W-Y-S-I-A-T-I. It's what you see is what there is. So if you don't see it, it doesn't exist for you. This is from scientists who are dealing with the brain. I'm referring to Kahneman. I did it in this talk before. He wrote the book, and the title is Thinking Slow, Thinking Fast, which kind of fits to our panel. And he points out two different ways the brain is working. And the fast brain is like active, emotional, and stereotypical, on the other hand, and unconscious. And I think that's the way the reception of fast news work. You react with emotion. And then there's the slow part, and it's more conscious and reflects. But it's much more exhausting, and it's lazy, and it takes much more effort to activate this part of the brain. And I think that's kind of an effort that reporters and journalists just have to take, because I think that's what people and audiences need. They need somebody who helps them to put the context on the fast news. And it's work, but it's very necessary, and I think it's a service to the readers to do that work. And it's very nice for me that it totally fits with the theories of the brain.
But there are also the scientific evidence that shows the kind of chemical reactions that you get from consuming things quickly, or the kind of the need to respond immediately to an email or a news notification or an alert. If you've been in a newsroom where you've got Chartbeat on the wall, you could spend your entire shift just watching the wall, because it's just... you can become obsessed with watching kind of real life data about what your audience are doing. Yeah. So being able to step away from that and understand when are the opportunities to dip in and to dip out, and what does this tell me, is incredibly challenging, because it does, our brains are being rewired.
Yeah.
You have another quote.
Yeah. Well, I do have another quote, as a matter of fact, and it's around having the idea of, and this is a slow news philosophical element, these news-free days where you can shut down. And just coming here to Europe, I've been this trip over here for about 3 weeks, and it's been much easier to be out of range in one way or another, and realize how much it isn't necessary to be in that constant 500 times on the telephone or the iPhone and connected to so-called news. How, well, again, we get back to il dolce far niente, just sitting in a cafe and not finding it necessary to sit there with the iPhone kicking out CNN and with a copy of the New York Times. My New York Times today is a day old. It's just incomprehensible on some levels, but it's so reassuring. And the quote I will find here in a moment, and it's an Oregon psychologist, Ruth Parvin, who was explaining, right in line with what the two of you are talking about, that she's diagnosing anxiety and depression in her patients based on this perpetual news consumption, and she's prescribing news-free days to her patients. If we hear about the same shooting, such as like at Umpqua Community College near us, 15 times a day, that doesn't count, she says, psychologically in the brain you're talking about, simply as one event, but it alerts the nervous system every time we hear it in the same potentially damaging way.
I take two words that you use, people and trust. Some words that I think that we are all, it's the base of our profession, people and the trust. That it's formed together the community, the idea of community, people that trust themselves and some others. How could we regain this trust? How could we rebuild some communities in a landscape that now it seems completely completely isolated with readers that it's...
Well, the previous panel was full of people who were doing exactly that. So if you look at the engaged journalism movement, you see the kind of work that's being done by like my colleague Andrew de Vigal at the Agora Center at the University of Oregon, Jennifer Brandel and the team at Harkin and others. There's some really important work going on in terms of listening to audiences and finding new ways to really understand what are the questions that audiences want us to answer. We don't necessarily know best about what the community wants. That's a very arrogant and arguably old-fashioned and dated idea. We need to change that relationship between the people formerly known as the audience, as Jay Rosen would refer to them, and journalists. And often we might find that there are surprising kind of questions that audiences want to have answered, that there are processes and ways that we do things as journalists that we take for granted that audiences don't have and don't understand because they've never worked in a newsroom. They don't understand why this story is page 1 and this one is on page 10. We actually need to do more in terms of communicating our news values, editorial decisions, and creating opportunities to build and kind of grow that trust through transparency. So, a couple of examples of that. The Coloradian in Fort Collins in Colorado and the Seattle Times have both opened up their editorial meetings and said anyone can come to our editorial board meetings and they can hear the decisions that we are
as observers or participants?
Well, that's then another question. To what extent they can participate. Yeah. But just even that process of saying this is not a closed shop, that we'll make this available as a hangout, or we'll do AMAs with our editor and with our publisher and things like that, are creating new opportunities for engagement with senior editorial staff that historically really haven't existed. And they're baby steps, but they are still quite big steps in many cases, and quite challenging steps for those reporters.
I think because you said it's important to listen to the audiences to gain the trust, but I think it's even more than listening, because I think there is a real great vision, desire to get attention. So I think the audience wants attention. So the question is how to not only listen, but to also give attention to the people. It's like finally everybody wants to be loved and wants to get attention. I think it's very interesting because it's even much more work to give back, to listen and then to give an answer. Because I think what we have been doing for quite a long time now is listening and asking for opinions, but not reacting enough and answering to that. I mean, I know it's a bunch of work and it's huge. But for example, we have a regional newspaper in Austria, and they have something they call regionauts, like astronauts, but for regional areas. And these people actually are like community reporters. But what's interesting is that the newspaper organizes, for example, photo workshops for these people. And they can do lots and lots of these workshops because they love to get involved into the newspaper. So the value is not that these reporters, community reporters, bring content, but that, of course, their friends then also read the newspaper, and that their real conversation between the newsroom and the people is starting. So I think this attention you give to your audience is very important.
I think there's also, allied to that, is around how you badge that. So if you are taking that content as a result of that kind of listening or that engagement, making it clear, this is where the content came from. You participated in this process. You told us this is what you wanted, or this is what you have produced. Yep. And it's then presented in a way where it's made clear that that's been the kind of relationship and dynamic. You see that very clearly, for example, in comments strategies across a number of organizations, where depending on who you talk to, some journalists will say, I never look at the comments. I certainly never respond to the comments and kind of get into the weeds of the people who are replying to my article. Well, why not? What are the opportunities there to develop relationships with audiences, to potentially find different perspectives and angles and stories that you might otherwise not find, or indeed to just create a story that is based on the comments alone, which shows that the comments are valued. And there are organizations who are experimenting with new ways of doing this. But for too long, many organizations have said, yeah, tell us what you think, but actually we put it in a drawer and we don't pay any attention to it because we still know best.
I think it has a strong connects to what we're talking about slow news, because, I mean, if I just give you some information, I can do that really fast. But if I have a conversation with you, then I need, time and slowness. I think it's a very strong connection between the engagement topic and the slow.
No question, but I believe the premise that the onus is on the audience remains an integral part of all of this. So that I'm not going to hit you.
Okay, good.
so that we decide. You just went backwards and wanted to
brought back some memories. Yeah.
Pardon?
Carry on.
We decide as the consumers by analyzing what's out there, what stands the test of time. We decide if there's incomplete information coming in from a breaking story, that we don't have to hear every incremental update that often is wrong. We decide, because nobody can be objective, whether the information over time is fair and accurate and clear. We decide to shut it off if we know more than the person talking to us. We decide after some time with some news outlet if we trust the sources. I have a long list of these items where we take charge, not at the expense of what the two of you are saying, but I think that we have allowed ourselves, it's not that this is citizen journalism, but it's citizens determining what is the journalism we want to consume.
But
and
I don't think
slow
most
stuff is out there.
I don't think most news consumers are sufficiently equipped to be able to make the kind of decisions that you have just described.
It seems as if you suggested that the task of the journalist is to teach the audiences not to read their breaking news.
Yeah, and maybe that will slow them down. And no, I think that we can't sell short the level of sophistication of the audience.
I'm not saying that audiences are unsophisticated, but often the lines become very blurred. So if you look at, say, cable news, much of that is not news, it is commentary. But audiences would often describe it as news rather than commentary. And they can't necessarily differentiate between the two, partly because of the way it's badged.
I hate to hear you say they can't differentiate, but you may be right, and maybe this is a time to bring in our audience.
Yeah.
Yeah?
So we speak about readers, we speak about cast, we speak about questions. So I hope that there's someone of us, of you, of them. Oh, some question for you.
Yeah.
Please, I don't know if there is a microphone.
There is a microphone, and then our leader, Andrea, has assigned me to help us break the fourth wall. So I'm going to wander amongst you, as we say in the UK, right? Mm-hmm. Amongst and whilst you ask questions.
Betwixt, I think is the word you're searching for.
Hello, yes, I want to ask about the question of long-form journalism, which is, if I understood it correctly, the form of slow news that we want to promote with more commentary. And I heard in several places how people like maybe click a long-form article, but then they will read the first two paragraphs and the last ones, and I see it in myself too, that I do that often. And I wonder, maybe Daniela, you can talk about this, how maybe the younger generation also long-form essay journalism, because I also think it's very important. I just don't really know whether it's still relevant for a lot of people. Like, obviously it is for us who also write, but the people who have a news app and like to read the headlines and get their news through that, and that's it. I don't know how, what is the future of long-form audience also?
I think what you mentioned is that there is lots of attention for very short pieces and for long form. So the middle length is just the thing nobody seems to be interested in. And I have two examples for you. The first one is if you take online platforms like as Vies, they really have long pieces, and they are read. That's not a very young generation, but a younger generation. And then if you take Facebook posts, I don't have empirical data on that, that's just my feeling. You have a kind of a new form of long-form Facebook posts that seem, from the reactions I see, seem to be read quite a lot and shared quite a lot. And so I think that there is a need and there is an audience. I think it's just the middle length. It's really a problem. Nobody needs it. Of course, it depends a lot. I mean, if you don't tell a good story in a long form.
Well, and I think that's the key, really, is so much of it is about good storytelling, unexpected stories, and that can enable long read to reach an audience. And if you look at some of the best examples of long read journalism, it's still in men's magazines. GQ and Esquire produce fantastic long form journalism, but they're not necessarily an obvious place that you would think of to go for news and information. But they have great content. Similarly, if you look at the Economist, which obviously is a much more kind of niche audience, but again, home of a lot of long reads. Or some of the kind of profile pieces that you might read in, say, something like The New Yorker. There was one a couple of years ago, an interview with Sir Jonathan Ives, the chief designer for Apple. And it took me, and I probably read reasonably quickly, but it took me over an hour to read that profile, but I'd never read an interview with him anywhere ever before. So, and yet he's clearly an incredibly influential designer and technologist. So I wanted to invest that time because he was not somebody that I would have ever been exposed to kind of elsewhere. But interestingly, when I spotted it in my social feed, I didn't have time to read it. I saved it to, I use a program called Instapaper. There are others like Pocket and Evernote, where you can just kind of bookmark this and say, okay, this is the long piece, and this is going to take me a while to read. I will just save that for later, for when I've got more time to read this on a commute or on a beach or on a cafe or whatever. So again, showing to audiences, not just producing long-form content that they might want to read, but also saying, here's how we can make this easy for you to come back to this at a time that is more convenient for you in your life. And we need to do more, I think, to educate audiences about how they can use some of those tools to support their information needs.
And one thing to add, I think that the question, do people read long reads or not, is not a question of age, it's a question of education and, habit.
You're back.
There was another question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, I want to thank you because I think this is a very important issue that we just keep living up here and we're not staying on the ground because we're constantly in touch with some media world without realizing what's around us. So thank you for addressing this. And I was thinking, I had an idea, maybe you said that there are people who want to read large stories. There's an audience for that. But I think that we also need to reach the people who don't want to read the long stories. So I thought maybe there will be a way where we can give the new snackers snacks with context. Do you think there will be a way where we can combine those things and, snack context?
Yes, and I think if you look at, say, the work that CNN does on their website, that they usually have a slug at the top, which is just one or two sentences that says, this is what this article is about. And that can tell you all you need to know. But if you want to go on and read the 800-word piece, you can do so. So more of the... look at DigiDay. I don't know if any of you are familiar with DigiDay. They actually have a button on the left-hand side of their website, which says TLDR. And if you click that, the text on the page changes, and it shows you the short, the too long, didn't read version. And that's a really kind of smart technological way of just kind of offering an audience a long and short version of a story. And I think it's not only quite cutesy, but I think actually it responds to a genuine audience need. Maybe,
in my understanding, slow and long is not... slow doesn't have to be long.
Right. Yes, that's a really extraordinarily important point because we should not look at having to invest a lot of time unless we want to, and these are not mutually exclusive.
Yeah, so for me, slow news is about giving the context, stepping back, waiting until you really know what to say, and then, there's the famous saying, I didn't have time to write a short letter.
Pascal, yes.
And we should also not just restrict this to thinking about text or video.
Yeah.
You should also think about audio. So one of the phenomena that we have clearly seen over the last few years is the kind of the serial effect, which has generated interest in podcasts and kind of long-form audio storytelling. And that, if you wanted to listen to all of Series 1 of Serial, that was a substantial commitment. They've just dropped... and the team behind that have just dropped S-Town, which is a series based in Alabama, and my wife listened to the first 4 episodes in a row because she was binging on it in the way that you would do a Netflix drama, because she found the storytelling so compelling, and she said, if I didn't have to go to sleep, I'd have listened to even more. This is not necessarily a kind of movement or a philosophy that's just applicable to kind of the written word. We should also think about it across other platforms too.
Mm. Okay, I have one more quick question, if it's okay. You said that we should also give attention to our audience, not just listen to them, but also engage. But do you think that our objectivity will be in danger if we do so? Because maybe we will talk to the people and tell them what they want to know. Because maybe we respond to that in a way we are not aware of ourselves. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah, you think
But-
they're like
No,
like a beauty pageant.
Yeah. Okay, of course you can go into the direction of clickbaiting, but I wanted to ask you, what is your objectivity?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we learn at school that it doesn't exist.
So, I mean, if
But
you...
I mean it. I don't that you don't make content because they want to know and want to see that, but what you think they need to know or to see. You understand what I mean? So if you show something they will not like, that they will respond all negative, and then next time maybe you'll think that, oh, I'll write something else because I don't want people to respond
I don't think
negative.
that you have to fear that given the innate arrogance of journalists. I really don't. I don't mean it as a joke. I think that that's the case. But if I may just tell a quick tale from the so-called real world, as I left to come to Europe, I wrote an op-ed for the newspaper in our state capital, the Statesman Journal. And it was just kind of an arrogant Trump attempt at saying something negative about Trump, and I said, I am so glad that I'll be going to Europe. I'll be gone to Europe, then to Asia, then to South America over the next several months, and it'll be just such a relief to get out of America during this time because it won't be Trump, one disaster and catastrophe after another. And I was on the receiving end of a lot of this anonymous commentary that was mostly good, get out of here and stay out kind of stuff. And I decided to respond to each one. And my colleagues from the University of Oregon may be horrified to learn that my response was to invite the writers to sit in on one of my classes when I return, and then to come to lunch at the student union, and we would talk about what they experienced. And what was amazing about it, and it's a real indication, I think, of the fast news phenomenon causing so much trouble in the current environment that we live in through these things that we all have in our pockets. All of them, as soon as I wrote that, they wrote back with an entirely different tone, not that arrogant, aggressive, usual commentary tone, but more normal kind of correspondence that you might expect with cursive and a fountain pen on stationery, saying how much they appreciated it. Most of them didn't accept the invitation immediately. They said they would consider it, but that they appreciated the response. So I accept and engage your premise, but think that if we act otherwise, it might also work. And I hope you guys will back me up when they show up on campus.
Because they want your attention. That's what I meant. But the backing up, I think it's a very important issue, and I think it's an even more important issue for female journalists, because you get all this sexual harassment, which I guess you didn't get. And so I think back up, I hope.
Yeah. No, I'm making a joke.
Sorry.
Inappropriate joke. Yes.
Sorry. I don't get the fine tunes in English.
It was body language, but you just weren't seeing it. Yeah.
So I think backup is a very important issue. I don't think that the newsrooms and the news organizations provide enough backup for the journalists, for the female journalists in particular, and also for the freelancers, because there are so many freelancers. Because if you know that you won't get support, be it personal support, be it a lawyer, then I think this is really something that makes a censorship in your head. And there are some studies on this issue that it really happens. And I think that's really important. So thank you for addressing it.
Yeah, I think you made a really important point, but I would say I think it's a two-way street. So you don't know what you don't know is a principle that applies to audiences, but it also applies to journalists. So yes, we have an important job to take the old BBC maxim of inform, educate, and entertain audiences, and I think that applies across the journalistic and media landscape. But equally, there are plenty of things that we as journalists don't know either. And so being able to bring a more diversity of opinion and voices, personalities and backgrounds into newsrooms is incredibly important to be able to do our jobs better. So yes, we need to continue to offer content and material to audiences that they don't necessarily know that they want or need, but we also need to understand the same is true of us. We also need to have our views and worldviews challenged from the audiences too.
There's one other point regarding slow news and comments. And in the old slow news days that existed when most people got their news and in a newspaper, ink on paper, there was not this anonymous commentary option. Almost all newspapers required knowing who had written the letter. And that would change the dynamic if more outlets did and more are doing the old school job of requiring a real identity to be connected to comments.
Well, or just using other things that just slow that process down. So there's a newspaper in Norway for their technology section. They have said you have to answer a short quiz with 2 or 3 questions about the article, and only once you've responded to those questions can you then post a comment. So it puts a barrier in place to being able to comment. And then what they found is the quality of comments has gone up exponentially.
Yeah, because often people don't even read the article. Right. They want to discuss the topic and not the article.
But just the title.
Yeah. Yes. So people are experimenting with ways of doing this.
There's another question here.
Thank you. Someone mentioned local news during the debate. So how big do you think is the potential for local news in slow journalism?
So sorry, I couldn't quite catch that. What was the potential for slow news
in local news?
In local news.
Yeah.
Gosh, that's a big philosophical question. I think to some extent you already see that. If you look at kind of weekly publications, they're working on a very different timeline and timescale to dailies, because they still make most of their money. In many cases, it's around sort of 80% of their revenue, if not more, from the print publication. They actually have a very uneasy relationship with digital technology. If you give away too much of your story on Facebook or Twitter or on your website, someone is not going to make that conscious decision to go out and physically buy your paper. So certainly with a lot of this kind of really sort of smaller town and kind of rural publications in the US, some of them have deliberately just have no relationship with a whole bunch of digital platforms, or their website is simply a PDF of the previous week's paper, or they might have literally the headlines of what's coming up next. And if you want, with no click-through, nothing is hyperlinked, you still have to kind of physically buy the paper, because their business model is dependent upon that kind of physical purchasing. So they're already, I think, in many respects doing this because they recognize that their livelihood depends on it. For others, I think they need to look more and more at how do I differentiate between what I have to offer on my website or in my publication versus what's on Facebook message boards or groups or kind of conversations that people are having and sharing. And in many cases, that may well be that taking a step back, providing additional layers of analysis and interpretation and context and understanding, as well as kind of debunking rumors which might be floating around on social or elsewhere. And that's something that newspapers have always done, but arguably newspapers, local radio, local television, it's even more important to kind of do that and to do that well now, when sources of misinformation are kind of growing exponentially, but sources of kind of accurate, trusted information are in many cases being reduced. So I'm optimistic about the space for local in this environment.
We have finished our time.
May I say one thing quickly?
Yeah,
really quickly. The onus is on the news consumer, I said earlier and repeatedly, but the onus is also on the news consumer to pay for some of this stuff. And if you do expect to get it all free, you might just get what you paid for, and you may wish to, not you guys, I mean the general public, may wish to spend some money.
A last word to you thank you very much to be here. I hope that you enjoyed the speech, but I also hope that when you come back to home, you continue to think about it. Don't lose the hope that something can change in the future. Something has started today, maybe started some years ago. We continue to to trust in something that we can change. So don't lose the hope and continue to fight for slow down and re-meaning the life. Thank you very much.
Have a nice slow afternoon.
Good work, good work. Thank you, thank you,
Thank you, thank you.
Good work, thank you, thank you. Ladies, just don't...
And I'm very glad to be here for the second time in 2 years with Professor Peter Lofer and 2 new hosts for our gang of slow newsers. But here we are with Damian Radcliffe. He's correct to the... Okay. Chambers Chair in Journalism at University of Oregon. And Daniela Kraus, Director of Forum Journalism and Media in Vienna. And of course, Peter Lofer, the main character, the founder of Slow News Movement. Yeah, it's a good definition. Why are we there? Speaking about a word that is such ancient meaning as slowness. We are in the age of acceleration everywhere. And we want to come back, to step down, to slow down, and to try to redefine our role as journalists in this society faster, every time more faster. And so I don't bore you more.
Victims of it. And so I recommend that we take charge. That doesn't mean something like citizen journalism, which is ludicrous. There's a Brussels journalist who says something along the lines that if you want to get your news from a citizen journalist, then I want to introduce you to my citizen dentist. It just does not work. We need professionals because otherwise we just have a dump. We just have a dump of information and information overload. We need the professional news reporter, but we as consumers have to know when to shut the stuff off, when to leave the iPhone in the car or at home when we go out to dinner. We need to have some so-called news-free days where we just don't engage in this 24-hour news cycle. The 24-hour news cycle fuels our innate fight or flight instincts that raise our stress level. We don't need to see the airplanes go into the Twin Towers over and over and over and over again. We do not need to see Donald Trump every day over and over and over again. It makes us ill.
The hosts are there, and so I let them speak about this. And I want to start with a simple question to Peter that started the movement, I think 7 years ago in my city, in Milan. This is a strange thing. But why and when you decide that you have to do something to the scenario, to the nightmare scenario that you face off?
So hello to all of you. It's really terrific to be here and to be back again after a year. And there's the microphone. I come from a radio background, so I really don't need a microphone. We just project. The slow news idea, which is not unique to those of us at the table here, but which I embraced about 7 years ago here in Italy, comes out perhaps from the slow food movement, which comes from here in Italy. And the abuses that we currently are experiencing in the United States under the Trump presidency are real-time, right now examples.
Now, yes. Well, hello everyone. Thank you to be here to listen this panel.
Of what's wrong with the 24-hour news cycle. The 24-hour news cycle is allowing this extraordinary, non-stop, relentless abuse of media and news media in particular, and the ethics of journalism as practiced traditionally by those who care about some sort of responsible way of purveying information. So there's no way to stop this, because even the, what did you call me, of slow news, of course I have one of these in my pocket, and even though this book, which is my manifesto for slow news, begins with me in a saloon in the far west coast of North America with a pencil and a piece of paper, there's no way we're going to stop this. So what I present to you and suggest, and what my comrades here will engage, I hope, is the idea that the onus is on us, the news consumers. There's no way we're going to stop this acceleration, but we don't have to be